on stage actually asking her the questions. We've reversed the roles for this one. Ira, I'll ask with a broad question to start with. You began your work focusing very much on gender, on women in history, Mughal women in history. Daughters of the Sun is now a classic. But with this book, I feel that we've slowly seen you sort of zoom out a little bit. The canvas is getting broader and broader. You moved to Akbar, that had battles and war and all of that, but it was still one life. Here you've got several compelling characters, several things happening. There's a huge political landscape, and it's a very interesting time. Was this a conscious choice to move to a bigger landscape?
Thank you, Manu. It's lovely to be here with friends in the audience as well, and a full house. How wonderful. I know thanks to Manu's rock star power, but still. Thanks for that question, Manu, which is really, really interesting for me as a writer. I very much started out thinking very deeply about gender, about the way in which gender was represented in this country. And in fact, my very first manuscript was A Song of Draupadi. Even though it was my fourth book to be published, it was the first book that I worked on for years and years, as I sort of tried to think about the ways in which women are offered roles to emulate in today's Indian society, day-to-day life. Who are we offered as girls, as women? Who are the people who are offered to us, whose examples we are meant to emulate? And it became something that was very frustrating and eventually angering for me to see that mythological characters were presented in a way in which they are meant to be historical, like they are believed to have lived, and we are meant to emulate them as if they were living, breathing people in the past, whereas historical women were largely forgotten. And my second book, Heroines, in which I write about some of these women, going right back to Ira Mukhoty in the 6th BC, through Mirabai, and all these amazing, feisty, tempestuous women have all been sanitized to such a huge degree that they are almost unrecognizable. And for example, Mirabai, in her own home state of Rajput, she's worshipped as a goddess. But the children in Rajput homes, in elite Rajput homes, the girls are never told to emulate Mirabai's example, which was so scandalous because she questioned caste, she questioned patriarchy, she questioned all of these structures. So today, even though she's kept in people's, part of that sort of temple structure, their daughters are never told to emulate her example, which is something really interesting and something which really struck me. So I was moved to write all these gender-specific books, as you say, finishing with Daughters of the Sun. But patriarchy is something which is really deeply embedded. It is not about hating men at all. I have loads of lovely men in my life, many feminist men in my life. It's about the structures around us which are entirely geared to men. So whether it is the educational system, whether it is the judiciary, whether it is law enforcement, there are men everywhere. There are men writing the laws, there are men writing books, there are men writing histories. So the entire structure is geared towards men. Even data is manipulated to suit men. There was this fabulous book a few years ago, Invisible Women, by Caroline, I forget her name, Criado Perez, who wrote about how data, which is such a pure thing, you would think it's beyond gender, but is manipulated in such a way that the things that are created around data, such as safety equipment, such as astronaut suits, are actually based around the typical male figure rather than the female figure. So you see, our whole world is sort of geared for the enhancement of men, and this has become something subliminal in people. You think it is normal. So when I wrote all these books, I found that little by little, I was being invited to panels that were women only. I was asked to come to talks where they were talking about her story, and all these things were happening around my books, which is not a bad thing in itself, but somehow I thought there was an element of defanging of the message that I was making. It was a sort of diminishing of what I was doing, a sort of putting me into a certain construct which could be safely sanitized and then put away into a safe space which would not be threatening to the larger questions that were around us. I remember when I used to make my presentations on heroines, for example, I would say that I've talked about 8 women characters through the ages, over 2,000 years of Indian history and thought. And yet, if you Google each of these 8 women and put them on a slide, just by a normal Google search, and you put them, from just popular imaginings, they all look similar. They all look like actors in a Saas Bahu serial. Because despite them being at origin so different, Draupadi so dark, for example, Mirabai or Amrapali in the 6th BC would have looked so different, but they all look the same in today's consciousness. They are all these very fair, heavily jeweled, hair very neatly groomed, Brahminical women, right?
But Ira, I have a quick follow-up on this.
Yeah.
You said that now that you've moved to these so-called masculine themes and topics.
But you haven't let me finish, Manu.
No, that's precisely. I just wanted to add up one thing. I wanted to add one thing to what you were saying.
Yeah.
Do you think as a woman writing about these things, you're bringing a very, very distinct perspective?
Spoiler situation where I could really pinpoint the sort of things that interest and excite me.
Your book begins, if I remember correctly, with Aurangzeb's death, right? And that period. And the traditional wisdom was that the 18th century was a time of decline in the country, and it's in this vacuum that the British essentially grow and come into power. But you, in a way, you're answering back or sort of slightly nuancing this point by showing that, yes, while the empire declined, there was a new flowering of places, cultures, courtly culture, all of that happening, and Awadh was one of those places. I'm going to split this question into 3 parts because it's all about characters in the book, right? So firstly, you have these very compelling, interesting Nawabs. There's a gay Nawab, even though the British are confused about him and they call him a womanizer. There's Shuja, who's defeated by the British and gives him a bit of a shock, but he's also a very stylish, impressive, imposing kind of figure. So those are the men. And those, I think, in many ways, Shuja and his son are the main sort of highlights of your book. So tell us a little bit about these Nawabs. But alongside them, there's also these French mercenaries who've come in, and some of them are a bit like, we cancel them in today's world, and some of them in many ways are very, very interesting people as well. So just tell us about the cast of characters, and then we'll come to the 2 Begums.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a lovely question. And the 18th century has been presented to us often as a time of decline, as Manu was saying, because that very much suits the British point of view. It suits their purpose to show us as a country in terminal decline, where there's anarchy all around, the rule of law has completely disintegrated, the Mughal power at Delhi desperately needs saving, the whole country needs saving, and who better to save them than the British? So that is the sort of narrative that was left here for a very long time. Actually, the 18th century, as you very well know, Manu, is a time of actually great effervescence. It's a time of, so much happening around us, because what happens isn't a simple crumbling. So yes, definitely there were structural problems that came about because of Aurangzeb's extremely long reign, basically, He ruled for such a long time that his sons were middle-aged men by the time he died, so they were in no shape to carry on, ruling, which is, I think, a lesson to all Indian parents to let their sons stand on their own feet much sooner than they do.
I think you're going to get cancelled, Ira.
I thought you were the one aiming for cancelling. So yes, there were structural problems in the Mughal Empire, but what happens when the center is unable to control the entire country is not that the country just sits back and falls apart. Instead, these very powerful subedars, so subedars were the governors of the different subas, or the districts, administrative districts. So what they start doing, the powerful ones, Hyderabad, Murshidabad, Awadh, the Rajput states, is that they see that there's nobody at the center to impose their will, especially after Nadir Shah in 1739. So they decide that they will keep all the revenues for themselves, the tax revenues, of which they are meant to send every year a proportion back to the Mughal center at Delhi. So they keep the money. This is really the crucial point. They keep the money and they start investing in their own districts and investing, therefore, in culture, in art, and all of these things. Because since there is chaos at Delhi, all the artisans, the poets, the musicians, the dancers all start slowly flowing out of Delhi, looking for other sources of patronage, and end up in these so-called sub-imperial centers like Awadh. So this is the point at which we have these 2 very charismatic rulers in Awadh, that that they would start to cast aspersions on the ruler, debase the ruler, make him seem inefficient and, in many ways questionable, even their moral character. So they started doing this with Asaf and saying, he's surrounded by beautiful women, he spends his time in the Zanana all the time, he does nothing else. And then they sort of seem to scratch their heads because they're like, hang on, there are no children and there are no real women that we see around him. So they start to get a little mystified, and they were like, there are such horrifying things happening around Asaf-ud-Daula that we cannot even speak about it, right? But others who are less unwilling to speak about it do say that he was a homosexual, and there was no problem in Lucknow with this. So we have Asaf-ud-Daula, who is facing at this point so many challenges because the British are really trying very hard to get into Awadh's affairs. They're very interested in getting a resident to live there. They're very interested in stationing troops there, which the Nawab will have to pay for. And he is a really skillful diplomat because till his death, he more or less keeps them at bay. He uses all his diplomatic skills. He uses his hospitality. He's a very charming man, very hospitable. The famous Lucknowi hospitality and tehzeeb come up around the time of Asaf-ud-Daula because he is so famously generous and hospitable to all those around him. It's at his death, really, and this is where more or less my book ends, that the British are really able to make inroads into Awadh.
I must ask you about the French mercenaries as well, but also another very interesting cast of characters in the book is the Khwaja Saras.
The Khwaja Saras, the eunuch.
Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about them? Because they're also not the stereotype that we usually see.
That's right. So another, sort of group that we have forgotten about a lot from the 18th century are the Khwaja Saras, who were the elite eunuchs of the court. So this was a time in which eunuchs were really important in courtly culture. They served a number of roles. And what was interesting about the way in which I found that they were written about by, say, a historian of the era, so Faiz Baksh, who writes a history of the Zenana of Awadh because he is attached to one of the Khwaja Saras. He is a translator and a letter writer, and he is the attendant of one of the great Khwaja Saras of Bahu Begum. And he writes of him as being a very manly man, of being a very sober, upright, dignified man, a man with a lot of status in Awadh, a man with a huge entourage around him. And this sort of manly kind of way in which he is depicted is the way in which all the Khwaja Saras were written about, and completely at odds with how the British view eunuchs. For the British, they are androgynous, feminized, sort of, suspicious kind of characters. But the ones that are written about in Awadh are very powerful men, because what happens is that the Khwaja Saras inhabit that liminal space between the Zenana and the outside world, because they have access to the inside, the household, the Zenanas. They carry out the orders of these elite women. Bahu Begum, Nawab Begum send their Khwaja Saras out into the world for diplomacy, for military campaigns, for ruling their jagirs. And at the same time, they are in the domestic space, which is sacred, right, which the British have no access to. So they are something that the British are never able to get a real handle on. And I'll give you an example. At one point, Bahu Begum sends her, one of her main Khwaja Saras, Bahar Ali Khan, to Hastings in Calcutta to try and get him to release her jagirs, which he has, at this point, grabbed all her estate. And this eunuch shows up at Calcutta and makes his plea, but Hastings isn't convinced for other reasons, because other ministers are working against them. And he refuses to do this, but he gives him a khillat, a robe of honor. But the Khwaja Sara says, how can I accept this robe of honor since I have not carried out my duty to my mistress? So I must return it to you. This is the etiquette. Hastings doesn't understand this at all. And
either.
No, that's right. So we have two main women at this time that I write about. So one is Nawab Begum, who is the wife of Safdarjung of Delhi and the mother of Shuja-ud-Daula. And then we have Shuja-ud-Daula's wife and then widow. When she dies, she is the queen mother because she is the mother of Asaf-ud-Daula. So these two women are originally from the royal families of Delhi. They are very familiar with Delhi courtly culture. Bahu Begum has been married in Delhi by Muhammad Shah Rangila himself, so she has a huge trousseau. She is fabulously wealthy. And at the time of Buxar, when Shuja-ud-Daula is told that you will only get your country back if you pay this huge war indemnity, Bahu Begum comes to Shuja-ud-Daula and offers him a huge amount of her jewelry and her trousseau to pay off this debt. And this is the moment at which Shuja-ud-Daula really recognizes the worth of Bahu Begum. Till then, he was, as I was saying earlier, very much a woman woman's, like an enthusiast of courtesans, a woman's man, you know. He was caught climbing up the walls of young ladies' apartments many times. So it seems to be that at this time, when she does this thing and restores him to his throne, he realizes her worth, and they really become partners in founding this culture at Faizabad. And later on, when he dies, Asafudollah becomes Nawab, and the British put enormous pressure on Bahu Begum to yield this treasure, because she's left with far more treasure than this, and they want desperately to get all her money and her treasures, and she refuses. And she says, all this money was given to me by Shuja'ud-Dawla in repayment for the money that I gave him to release his country after the Battle of Buxar. So it is legally mine. So you can see just through this incident what a sharp mind she had, how ambitious she was, how she knew her own worth, and how she stood up to the British despite being a completely parda-bound woman. So no one could even hear her voice. She had to speak to them behind a curtain with an interlocutor, and she would whisper her messages to them. I know that we don't have much time.
We have no portraits of her, right?
We have absolutely, nobody would have dared to paint an actual portrait of her. She was in complete parda. It was only after her husband died that she even started writing letters. So even, she was not allowed to communicate with men. When she died, Saadat Ali Khan, this is in 1815 or so, he had all her clothes burned or buried so that no man would cast eyes on the clothes which had lain against her body. But despite that,
we are running out of time, but I really want you to cover the French mercenaries.
Oh, we haven't talked about the French.
I brought that up twice, but we keep forgetting.
This is a book about the French, believe me. So, this was an interesting time in the 18th century. We often think of nationalities, loyalties in a very different way today, with nation states and patriotism being a certain way today in the 21st century. If you will forgive me using a sporting metaphor, and some of you in the audience who have been in Delhi with me have already heard this one before, but if you think of the members of an Olympics team, for example, that is the way in which we think of loyalty, patriotism, nation states today. One flag, one national anthem, everyone speaking the same language, religion, etc. But really the 18th century was more like the members of an IPL team. It was whoever would pay you the most, you would basically belong to that person. So it was highly transactional. We must always remember this. It's something that came out with me very strongly when I was researching these men, because there's one fascinating character, for example, called Antoine Paulier.
Somewhere? Is there no mic going around somewhere? Why? Yes, of course. I don't see a mic, though. Yeah, I think we can hear you.
Yeah.
Source material.
That's a really good question. So for the French, the source materials were very widely dispersed. So for one of the adventurers that I look at, he has a family archive in Chambéry in the Alsace region of France today, and he has a personal family archive that I was very lucky that William Dalrymple told me about this, so I was able to go there, and they very kindly allowed me to look at that. So I have a lot of letters that he has written during his tenure in India to all kinds of people, including his BB, who he took back home with him when he left India. So that was one source material.
The BB is the local wife.
BB is a local wife. So they usually didn't strike up formal liaisons, with these women. It was very rarely a real marriage in the Christian sense, but they were informal alliances. So they would have these BBs and live in a very semi-Nawabi style with the BBs, while also, of course, enjoying the perks of being European officers. So the French sources are very much there. They are little dispersed. Paris also has, in the bibliothèque over there, a lot of material on the French. And for the Indian side, the historian I was talking to you earlier, Faiz Baksh, who wrote about the life within the Zanana, has been absolutely critical, because it's a very neglected work, and yet it is so exciting, full of juicy gossip that Manu was alluding to about the bickerings between the Begums, Khwaja Saras, about who had more power, for example. So those source materials are there. It has, I've spoken about this so many times when writing about the women. It's just that sources to do with these kind of stories tend to get forgotten, misremembered, and left aside and cast aside when talking about history in general.
Another question?
Have you done any comparison between the French occupation in Pondicherry, where there is a wealth of material available?
We can hear you, sir. We can hear you. You can use the mic. We can hear you.
Material available by a
Yes.
person called Anandarangan Diaries,
Yes.
who was a Douglashi,
Yeah.
But it's a surprising, gossipy, interesting
Gossipy, yes.
where the women were the corruption centers. And he narrates that the women folk of the French officers
Shocking.
shockingly
Yes.
gave the tradition how to be corrupt.
Yeah.
So many of the Indians learned the corruption from women. In the current context,
Yeah.
I feel it is a very interesting story. Any comparisons of that nature?
Yes. Women always the source of all evil, definitely. So I have not looked at Pondicherry's archives, I must admit. That is a whole different world, as you have brought out. I would be very interested in looking at this very topic that you have mentioned, the Dubhash. Is very exciting because Joseph-François Dupleix, the very famous Governor General of Pondicherry, his wife, Joanna Dupleix, had this Dubhash. And he has written his memoirs. And I would be very interested in writing a book on that interaction, the Dubhash and the French woman. But no, I haven't focused on Pondicherry because my aim is North Hindustan. Yeah.
But Ira, are you doing that general book on the French in India?
Who's paying me to do that, Manu?
Any more questions? I think one here.
Tipu Sultan, I would write about in a heartbeat because he is such a fascinating character, and I think he has not been done justice at all. From, we have one extreme and the other extreme writing about him, but he was a complex, complicated man, very much a man of his times, very much having to parley and negotiate and making deals with the devil also. And I think he would be somebody so relevant in today's world, and I would love to write about him.
Last question.
Do you think it's better to be a woman in the 18th century or right now?
Okay, that's just the best question, I think, today. Okay. That's a difficult one. That's a difficult one. I think, like always, it depends which milieu you are born in as well. If you are privileged, you are always able, like, it's true, some people have asked me, why do you always write about elite women when you're talking about women? The fact is that there's very little material as it is about women. So even elite women have very little written about. So if you are disenfranchised, if you're from a lower strata of society, there's almost nothing about those women. So I think generally speaking, whether it is this timeline or that, you are lucky if you're born in a place where your voice is given some kind of platform like I am given here today, for which I am very grateful. So do buy the book.
Thank you, Ira. Thank you to our wonderful audience. Thank you for the questions. Sorry
Thank
we
you.
didn't have enough time.
Thank
And
you,
Bangalore
Manu, for
Lit Fest.
taking the time.